Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Well, let me ask you something. See if you can relate. Has this ever happened to you? You played a game for a long time. Maybe you played it for years, maybe even decades. Doesn't matter. You played it for a good long time. And you know how this game works. And somehow a discussion about a rule comes up. Some friend of yours asks you, where's this rule? And you're like, oh, sure, I'll show you. And you go to your shelf and you take down your well-worn and well-loved copy of the rule book. And you start thumbing through it. And you're going to show them where this rule is. And it's right over... Well, wait a minute. It's got to be in this next section over here. Maybe it's on page 72, and you can't find it. You get really, really frustrated. So you tell your friend you're going to get back to him. You talk to your other friend, another enthusiast of the game, and they say, hey, don't bother. What do you mean? It's not in there. What are you talking about? It's not a rule. Not in the book anywhere. You sure? Yeah. How do we start using that? It has to be a rule. We've been playing it that way all since the beginning, haven't we? Or did we hear about it? I can't remember where that came from. And not only that, but I was talking to a guy at a con last month or online a couple of months ago, and he uses that rule too. And he's half a country away, or then another country. Where did they come up with it? Because everybody I know uses that rule mostly, right? I mean, how the heck did we make that up? Where did it come from? Does that sound familiar? So this video is really about those rules that you swear are in the book, but they're not. And how does that happen? How does that dynamic happen? I had to laugh. I was watching a video very recently. Ron Edwards is talking to another game designer, and he's talking about his game, I think it was Sorcerer, and the idea that characters have these things called traits, and they carry no real mechanical weight, but people read the book, and they expect them to. It makes sense for them. It should be in there, right? So even though the rule isn't in there, they insert that, and so when they use the trait, they'll say something like, well, I'm going to use my trait die now, add it to my die pool. And Ron says, well, no, you're not. And what do you mean? He goes, it's not a rule. You just made that up. It's something people expect to be in there, and so they insert it in there. So I'm going to give you what seems like a standard disclaimer right now, is this video is not about Dungeons and Dragons. It's not about D20. It's not about any of those things. It's about these rules that we swear are in the book, but they're not. And the example I'm going to use is from my own history. And it's something that's suggested by what I've been talking about lately anyway. But even if you hate Dungeons and Dragons, I would suggest, hang on, come down this rabbit hole with me, because it's a real fascinating look at us, at role-playing games, and how we end up doing stuff like this. Where do these rules actually come from? What's the dynamic? So the rule I'm going to talk about is this idea that 20s do double damage. They are critical hits. And I'm specifically talking about, TSR D&D, pre-3rd edition. So from 1974 all the way up to whenever 3rd edition came out. My friends and I talked to a bunch of them. We're all kind of an age. We started playing the game somewhere between 1978 and 1983 is when we were introduced to it and started playing Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing games. A lot of us don't play D&D anymore at all. And some of us, like me, I play it every once in a while. I'm having fun playing a whole bunch of other games. That's irrelevant. What's relevant is we were all there back then. And all of us, at some point, heard of this rule, that 20s did double damage. They were a critical hit. A lot of us were convinced that was part of the game, that was actually in the rules. But I got news for you. It's not. It's not in those games. I think if I have this right, it might show up in a couple places in the Rules Cyclopedia and Mentor Basic, like in the really advanced part of Weapons Mastery, and something in 2nd edition, which I never played, where somewhere in the really detailed Weapons Mastery, I think there's a few weapons where you do double damage on a 20 or something like that. However it actually works. But it didn't show up until, didn't show up in any of the rules that we were using, and that we had read. But somehow, that rule was there. Where'd it come from? And as a parallel, I'll talk a little bit about this idea that a 1 always misses and a 20 always hits. And surely, the 20 doing double damage, well, that's not in those books. We understand that. But that rule's in all of them, right? It's not. It's certainly not in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It's not in 1974 D&D. It's not in the 1978 Holmes Basic. It's not in there. Go look for it. You won't find it. I checked, as a matter of fact. Anyhow, so what actually happened? So I went to where you go when you have a question about the historical nuances of D&D. So I went to dragonsfoot.org. I did a search. I found all kinds of great threads, and a lot of these scholars there that are really into this sort of thing, offered a whole bunch of stuff. I didn't have to go asking any questions. A bunch of it had already been asked and it was there. So really, really neat, and it's fun to go down that rabbit hole. So apparently Gary Gygax himself was really opposed to this idea of critical hits being in the game. And there's an article in Dragon Magazine number 16 where he's talking about this idea that, like, a critical hit, doing double damage on a roll of D20, well, that's totally against the precepts of D&D. You shouldn't use that. Why was he talking about that? Where did that come from? This was already a bone of contention. Apparently it was already a bone of contention as the game was being written. What gives? Well, Gary would say something like that because he was really into this abstract notion of the game. It was all about abstraction. The combat rounds were 1 minute long originally. Even when they became like 10 or 6 seconds long later on, still the idea that one sword stroke, that wasn't a two-hit roll. A two-hit roll was this whole big swashbuckly dancing around thing, sometimes for an entire minute. And eventually you might tag the guy. But even then, the hit points didn't necessarily represent actual, real, quantifiable physical damage. They were this abstract representation of your mojo and your luck and everything else kind of running out. Your ability to withstand or avoid the telling blow, as Tim Cass would say a little bit later. That's what they were supposed to represent. So something like a critical hit locations, double damage, all that kind of stuff, that really didn't make any kind of sense, because that's not what Gary was trying to represent with that game. However, the other guy most closely associated with the early game, Dave Arneson, well, he liked this kind of stuff. He liked hit locations. He liked critical hits. He liked them so much that he put them in the game Empire of the Petal Throne, which TSR also produced somewhere around like 74, 75. My pedal head friends like Tim Harper and Ron Edwards, I guess, is a pedal head, and even Todd, that plays Lamentations of the Martian Princess with me, another pedal head. I have not had the pleasure of playing that game. But they show up in that game. But Dave Arneson didn't make that stuff up. Where did it come from? Well, it's something that predates all the role-playing games that were coming out at that time. They come from war games. And apparently this was part of wargamer culture and something that was very often expected to be in a game, where you had hit locations and critical hits. And maybe if you were rolling 2d6 and you rolled double sixes, and maybe that meant you did double damage to the other guy's tank or battleship or battalion or whatever was moving around on the field that you were trying to beat the snot out of. So this was something that was already expected. And how did this get imported to Dungeons and Dragons? Some people consciously decide, I'm going to add this rule, and add the rule of like double damage on a 20. But other people, they've been playing things like Empire of the Petal Throne, other role-playing games that came out concurrently, or came from the wargaming background, or did all of these things. And they were convinced it had to be in there. I'm sure I just missed it in this big, giant Dungeon Master's Guide or in the little brown books or whatever version they were actually reading. It's got to be in there, so we're going to use this. And a lot of people started using this rule of 20 does double damage, even though it wasn't in the book, because they expected it to be in the book. Some people made a conscious decision. Other people just kind of thought it was there. The other dynamic that, and I'm being a little more speculative here, but it certainly jives with my experience back in the day, and even now, as I'm looking at things like degrees of success or failure on that D20 roll, which once again, this video is not about, seem to be a much larger group of gamers, because once again, I'm talking about like my friends, people that, came in of an age, of 1978 to 1983. We weren't war gamers. We were kind of this second wave of people that got exposed to that game. Where did we kind of get exposed to this? A lot of us instinctively and unconsciously wanted the numbers on the die to actually mean something beyond success or failure. We already kind of assigned narrative weight to things like 1s and 20s because they were so incredibly abysmal or incredibly exciting because it was the highest number that you could roll on a die. A lot of times when we heard somebody else say that's the rule, we latched onto it. It made sense. Maybe we didn't even go back and check. We're just like, Fred says it's a rule, it's got to be in there. But it made a lot of sense to us, so we kind of latched onto it. I know for personal experience, I know I read it somewhere, and even though I kind of thought maybe 20s did double damage, I wasn't sure about critical fumbles and all these other critical hits, and I remember reading it in somebody's house, I couldn't remember where, and in one of the threads they linked an article where there was a PDF of a article from 1980 Dragon Magazine it was entitled something about good hits and bad misses, and it was this early idea for critical hits and critical fumbles tables. And I think that some other ones showed up later on. But so a lot of us got that idea from there. But there were a whole bunch of other people that never saw those articles. Because I talked to most people, and I didn't see that. I didn't own it. A friend of mine that I played with, it was in his house. And as I remember reading the article one time, I think I might have even copied some of it by hand. But that was it. A lot of people never got exposed to that sort of thing, but it was like this word of mouth, or it should be in there. Somebody said it might be in there, and it made so much sense to us aesthetically, or we were convinced because we played another game that it's got to be in there. It's got to be a rule, right? So that to me is a really interesting part of that dynamic, where there are people that just, who have inserted a rule. We've house ruled. We know we've house ruled a game, whatever game it happens to be. But very often, because of our history, because of what makes aesthetic sense to us, for whatever reason, it stands to reason this ought to be in this book. And I even find this happening with me today. We were playing Circle of Hands. We had to stop at one point and say, are we making this up? Because this sounds really familiar, and I'm not sure if this is really a rule, or if we're just importing that from a bunch of other games that we play. And we had this happen in Star Wars as well, where once again we have to stop and say, let's look this up, because I think we might be importing that from this other game. This happens. This is very, very common. So I'd encourage you to think about a lot of these rules that you're convinced are in the game, but you can't find. How many of them are there? I would suggest that there's actually a lot, because it's very, very easy to play for a long time, have a rule that shows up, you're really not sure where it came from. You swear it's in the book, but it's not. Go check. See if it's there.